My name is Chuck Lind. I'm going to talk about the Kroll Longleaf Lumber Company over in Louisiana. It happens to now be a museum through the generosity of the Kroll family, and I serve on the board of directors over there as the archivist of the board. So with that, we will get started with our presentation on the Kroll Longleaf. Basically, the South was the next place to go for
Chuck.
lumber. What? The South was the next area to go for lumber. They had run out of lumber up in the north pretty well. The Civil War was over. South was rebuilding, and things were moving west. So more lumber was needed, and the South was the best place to come at that time. Kroll Industries is located about 30 miles south of Alexandria. If you know the area, it's also between Alexandria and the casinos. But this would be the Sawmill complex. This was the Iron Mountain Railroad running through the area. It was established by C.T. Kroll. He got his start in the lumber industry up in Stamps, Arkansas, and he sold out. California, got into some oil out in California. This is a shot of his house in California, and it was taken to show some storm damage. But he was contacted by one of his friends that he needed to look at lumbering in Louisiana, and he did. So there's the Kroll family. There's C.T. Kroll, looks a lot like Mark Twain. And you got Stamps and Broughton, and then these were the next group that would run it till the final years of the mill. RD arrived. They were finishing up a commissary. The old commissary had burned down, so they were building a new one. He arrived on the Iron Mountain Railroad, which is right behind them, in 1899 to take over and learn how to run the mill. This is the finished offices and commissary that they had, and this would be that for a while, and then it also burned down. Burning down was a bad thing in lumber companies. This is RD working, trying to learn it. He's got a couple years to learn it because he finds out right after he gets there that his brother Stamps, who was the man who was going to run it, is contacted cancer, and he's got a short time to live. This was the second offices that they built, and it had a living quarters above with the screened-in porch here, and the offices were down below at that time. That office and commissary also didn't survive well. They had an employee that got a little chapped off about something in 1947, and he decided to burn the commissary and the offices down. So that was a bad situation for him. They then moved to RD's house. This was his house. They added on a little section in the front. You got the pay windows where people would come up to get their pay if they needed to be paid daily. And he moved to Alexandria for the education of his children. This is some of the stationery that the Krolls used, and it would remain Kroll Spencer Lumber Company for quite a few years. That was the partner in it. He was a minor partner, and upon his death, it became the Kroll Longleaf Lumber Company. We'll talk a little bit about the logging operations. Logging was, when they started in the 1890s, very primitive, some saws, and that was about it. You headed out into the woods, and these guys would usually camp out in the woods and work from there. They had the nickname flatheads, not lumberjacks, flatheads. It was named after a wood-destroying beetle called the flathead beetles. At that time, when they first started, all the lumber was hauled in by oxen in a cart or mules in a cart and brought into the mill. At that time, they had not set up a railroad. This is one of the wagons that became most popular in the South. It was made in Mississippi, and it was a Lindsay 8-wheel logging wagon. Here's a little sample of some of the first growth cuts that were cut there. For those of you on the West Coast, nothing like your timber that you were cutting out there, but for Southern pine, this was some pretty good sized lumber. They formed the railroad because their cuttings were having to go out further and further in April 21st, 1905, and it would run up until the 1950s. Here they are loading out in the woods. Loading was rather a crude way to do it at the time. You'd have your ox teams over here, they'd run a chain over here and then try to pull this log up and lay it on the top of the cart. Not a very efficient way to load and a little dangerous. What happened is Clyde Iron Works came up with this machine called a McGifford, very awkward looking machine, a very top heavy. They would tip over at times. They were self-propelled. There's another shot of it. And what was great about it is when they got to where they were going, it would set down on the ground. The wheels would pull up underneath it and you could pull the carts from underneath. So you load one car, then you pull another car forward and load it. It was much more efficient, did a great job of loading. The McGiffers were also being used well up into the 50s. This is a shot mid-50s before the railroad closed, and they were still cutting timber and loading with the McGiffer out in that area. From what we were able to find out, there are 6 of these McGiffers left in the country. Longleaf happens to have 2 of them on their site. A lot of them got cut up and scrapped after during the war effort. These managed to survive. There's a shot of the underneath. These beams right here would set down as you raise the wheels up, and it was powered by this chain drive going underneath and up into the boilers where the gears were. We have restored one of them over at Longleaf. This is our second one. We've just finished restoring it. It is able to operate on compressed air. Those are wooden booms that are put on. We just don't have the money to replace it with the boiler. So that's a future project. The way they got the logs to the track is they used a Clyde skidder. Originally, they had outriders that would carry the tongs out to hook them on the logs, and they would head out, hook the tongs, and then they'd blow the whistle. They'd have a whistle pulled out there and blow it. These could pull from about 400 feet at that time. Had a large crew. You had outriders and a pretty good sized crew that took to run this thing and bring everything in. What happened is they finally perfected them a little better. And this is a later skidder. It was called a rehaul, and it could pull logs from 600 feet away in 4 different directions. The worst thing about these was they destroyed everything in their way, because this log is being winched in. Anything in its way is pretty well being destroyed. Here's a Clyde. It's been stacking logs for the McGiffer to come by and load it. You can notice some of the fine track work they use. No ballast, reuse the track, and very, very poor, caused lots of derailments. Unfortunately, here's the Clyde today. The booms are around. We do have the booms. They're on the other side of the museum grounds, but it's one of the few that hasn't been scrapped. It's the only one left in the United States as far as we know at this time. Where the railroad ran, this is Longleaf right here, and the Iron Mountain came through the area of Longleaf, which is fine, but the Krolls wanted other places to go. So the first lines went over to Lecomte and over to their area. Later on, they went all the way up to Alexandria, and this line was one of the later lines. It went all the way over to Kurthwood. This is one of the early shaves they had on the line. This is taken about 1910, 1912. We know who took it because this is R.D. Kroll's bicycle. He rode out to take some pictures. What's unusual about this is a black crew. Black crews were not allowed on common carriers, but Kroll said if they can do the job, they can have it. So he had several logging crews of black engineers and firemen. Most of their track work and stuff was done by Mexican labor. Mr. Spencer, who you'll see here, they're writing him. They need some track people, and he moved to San Antonio due to health reasons. And so he was able to pick up people, and he would send them up on the Iron Mountain train, and he would type a list and tell them what they are, and that's the prices they got for them back in those days. Here's a pass from railroad, signed by Mr. Kroll, and it consigned out. These were passed out to the other people in the logging areas. They did log for several other areas around there. When they expanded over Lecomte, they mainly went there for one reason. As the Iron Mountain became the Missouri Pacific, the rates started going up. He wanted another source, so he built a office over and depot over in Lecomte, and they were able to then hook up with the Texas and Pacific and the Rock Island over in the Lecomte area. There's an inside of the offices here looking over in Lecomte. And that's where the railroad operations were pretty well run from for quite a few years. First passenger service was offered in 1905. And basically that was the passenger service, the back half of this caboose. That was caboose number 1. When this one came around a little later, that was called caboose number 3. So they changed it up a little. This was their next forte into passenger service. It was fixed so it could fit onto the rails, and it worked. It took their schedules, and it made the 12-mile leg on each end going up to either Lecomte or over to Meridian in the flying time of about an hour, which was a much improvement from the previous with the mixed train. They had a joint ownership. The Krolls got together with the Iron Mountain Railroad, and they built a depot at Longleaf. The one they built in Lecomte was their own depot, not joint with anybody else. They decided to get into a little more passenger service, so they bought a 440, the Red River and Gulf number 104. It was purchased new from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. And passenger service went from 1919 to 1926. After 26, they went back to mixed train. Evidently, it just didn't pay off as well as they did. So here you see the 440 in a couple of the locations along the line. It ended up its life at Longleaf, unfortunately working around the mill pond, and it doesn't look like it has any of its glory left from its earlier days. But it didn't totally go away. After it left here, it spent several years as the General Locomotive chasing another locomotive around Stone Mountain, Georgia. And it is presently in a museum over north of Atlanta. This happens to be C.T. Kroll. He hardly ever came to Longleaf. This was many, many years later. This is Mr. Spencer with him. They came over to inspect their logging operation, so they're pulling a logging train here. And that black engineer you've seen with the shay, there he is several years later. He's still driving the trains. This happens to be their yard area, right near the mill. The mill would be off to my left. Lots of various junk around, but this would be the man who would run the mill a few years later. This is Alan Kroll sitting on the steps of what they called the 202. They referred to this, of course, as a roundhouse, a railroad term. It's far from being round. This was a roundhouse that they built in 1947 after a tornado took down the first one that was built in 1920. We are presently refurbishing some of the tracks in there and trying to make it a little more usable for the museum and our use. They had shays 1 and 2. They would be scrapped a short time after these pictures were taken in the early 50s. The shays didn't get the speed they wanted on the line, so they were pretty well retired. They had the pulling power, but no speed. Meridian Lumber Company had this shay number 12, and here's what's left of shay number 12 right now over there. It was scrapped along with a lot of other things, but Alan Kroll told them don't sell it. He just got back from the war in the 40s. This was in the 50s, and he said, the metal's going to Japan, and I don't want it to go there. So it's still there. This is our number 102 locomotive, along with that early caboose that you'd seen earlier. This is the 105. It was also bought brand new. They bought several locomotives new. They didn't spend a lot of time buying used ones, but they got them dressed up. They got the white walls on it, nicely done lettering, good looking locomotives. This was the 200. Unfortunately, this was the 200 right before it got scrapped. And that happens to be the Clyde Skidder, and it didn't get scrapped. This is the 202. Kroll liked Caterpillar yellow, and he thought it would make his engines much more visible since the roads were very poorly marked. If this engine's going across the track, the railroad, that they wouldn't get hit. So that was his idea for there. There's another shot of the 202 pulling in a small train. This is toward the end of the life. It's out picking up some of the scrap and some of the other things around there. This is it. Still working in the 50s. Trying to get some of the last stuff in there logging. This the McGifford would have been down here, and this is a water tank, extra water tank for McGifford. This happens to be the 202 today. It's left in the machine shop, and we're trying to slowly refurbish it a little bit. It won't be a full restoration, just a cosmetic. This is the 106. It's one of the other locomotives. It happened to be the one that pulled in the last log train. Was the 106 pulled in our last log train before they went to trucks. And here you see the 106, the 400, and the 202 all lined up in front of the roundhouse. Unfortunately, right as we took over the museum, this is what the 106 looked like in this building that was sort of coming down around it. The building has since been rebuilt, and we are doing a cosmetic restoration on that at the moment. There's the 400. The 400 is also still there. Was nicely done. Had green cab, green tender. Everything they used after later years was pretty well an oil burner. Here's the 400. When we took over as a museum, Mother Nature was trying to claim it back to its existence, so that was part of the problems. After they shut the railroad down, they found out that Missouri Pacific would not come onto their grounds, so they ended up buying this switcher from and to do that, just push the cars out every day for the Missouri Pacific to pick them up. They used regular couplers on some of the cars. Lincoln pins were used on the work trains until the end of the line. This is one of the water tanks was over there. This is in Longleaf. The roundhouse would be down here a little further. We found this picture, and we decided to go exploring one day underneath there down in the ravine. And with that, we found the water spout for the thing, brought it up and put it in the museum. Some of the other cars they used, this was the caboose number 1. This was a crew car to haul people out to the woods every day. Another thing they used oxen and that for quite a few years for skidding, even with the Clydes. If they needed to be more careful, they sent the oxen in to skid it because they could avoid the small trees. With it, they also had one that the side came up on, and it was for feeding and housing the oxen while they were in a camp. Unfortunately, here's the cabooses a few years later, and since then, a forest fire has pretty well eliminated a lot of what's out there. Here you see the lumber cars. They pretty well built their own cars. This was a fairly common standard. It was called a skeleton because there is no deck on it. They used a little rail on the end bent up on each end, and you notice no brakes. They pretty well got the trucks from the Iron Mountain as they became the Missouri Pacific. Nothing had brakes, and they never used brakes on their cars until the end of service. This is the head of the railroad. He was not a Kroll. He was one of their friends, and he's over Lecomte at the Lecomte depot here. It's another view of their inspection car that they had over there. They had a nice series of cars. This was one of their rail inspection speeders that they had. Unfortunately, all of these pretty well met a demise at a later time. There's some of the things that this was taken in about 1970. And in 1980s, a fire pretty well destroyed the area, so all that's left is some parts here and there down the hill. Machine shop over there at the mill. It was a fully belt-driven machine shop. It had a foundry forge at one end, so they could use that for making parts. It's an overhead belt system throughout the system. It was powered by a steam engine up through the end of the war, and in the early 50s, a electric motor was put up in the ceiling here to continue running the belt drive. But pretty well equipped. Got a heater along with a place to put your coffee pot there. This is one of the lathes they got over there. And the interesting thing, loggers are a resourceful group. And the guy didn't like it because to change it, you always had to move the belt to change speed. You had to turn it around to make it run in reverse. So what he did is he built this contraption here that's a Studebaker truck transmission that he put in there. And the belt goes into there and this goes into there. He can shift this. He's got 3 speeds forward and 1 speed in reverse. So it made things a little easier for him in the shop. A couple other pieces. We got a radial drill press. We got a planer. These are all workable. We have refurbished all these, and this happens to be a wheel press that we've got over there. This is a double spindle lathe, and it predates everything. This was about a 1910 version of it. Nice long bed on it. They could pretty well do any kind of work on rail axles and wheels or anything that they needed like that. It was one of their heavy duty pieces of equipment. And while there wasn't much in the way of creature comforts, this was a water faucet they had here. And what they would do is they drop a block of ice in this every morning, and the coils went around the ice so you could at least get a cold drink of water during the day while you were working in there. Next to the machine shop is the what they call the parts building, and it is full of parts. Remember, there was no Home Depot back then, no big box store, so everything had to be purchased and brought in advance. And so it was pretty well full of everything when we took it over as a museum. Kroll did own a couple other sawmills. He owned the Meridian Mill and he owned Elko, which was his largest mill. The Meridian Mill was destroyed by fire, and Elko closed it in '44 while the Longleaf Mill continued to operate well up into the '60s. This is what you see of the Meridian Mill if you go airborne. This is one of the highways over there. You don't even know it's there by looking. It output about 100,000 board foot a day, which is about the same as what they did at Longleaf. When this mill burned, he pretty well loaded everybody in town, and he was a partner in the mill at Elko. So there's the mill at Elko. It could output about 150,000 board foot a day. He bought out his partner in the Elko mill and moved all of his people from Meridian up to this one. So there was a little animosity toward the Meridian guys because they came in and took over a lot of the jobs of the mill. There's an aerial of the mill in Meridian. You can see it's a pretty good sized mill. This is a sawmill, the chain. These are your kilns, and your planer area over here. And no, I'm sorry, this is the kiln, and this is the planer area. And then lots of lumber storage around. This is one of the engines coming in. They did not have any wigwam type burners. Everything was just an open burn. And this would be to haul the scrap trash out to the end here. It would drop off into the area here and burn. Pretty well burn 24 hours a day. For the mill town, life in the mill town, it was pretty well. This is Longleaf. This is the regular pond, the reserve pond. You've got the areas coming in. You got housing here. You've got more housing back here. You've got housing around the engine facilities. So it was not well planned, but it did have a little planning. This is one of the things we found in the mill as we're going through. If you're injured or died, somebody needs to let them know that claiming to be entitled to compensation. So you either need to show up or somebody needs to go for you. This was a hotel. was built across the street from Longleaf. It held the salesmen and things like that were coming through for the lumber. It was on the other side of the track. We also had a barber shop right here, and we had a doctor's office in here. This was the doctor of the town. This happened to be the post office. We have since moved the post office over onto the property Longleaf and restored it. This was the third commissary, I'm sorry. And of course, it burned in that fire in 47 by the unhappy employee. And it was since replaced right after that. Like many of the sawmill towns, when you lived there, you paid rent. You bought your groceries at the commissary store. So at the end of the week, they would figure out how much you owed to the commissary store, how much a part of your rent was, and then you would get paid what's left with these coins. And so your hopes of getting out of the situation weren't good. This happened for several years and changed back in about the 1930s. They changed and started paying them with American money. This was the carpentry shops, but after the fire of the commissary, it subbed in and they put a Holstein sign on the door. And so it became the commissary for a while until they could get the new commissary built. Didn't want to lose any business. The Krolls built two churches in Longleaf. This happens to be the white church, and there was a black church built further up. Baptisms were done in the creek. I wouldn't go in there. I've seen water moccasins and everything else in there. I don't think I'd be baptized at this point in my life. They also built a school for the black and a school for the white that went through about 6th grade. This was the mill superintendent's house at Longleaf, and this was their head salesman. He got this house, and this part of the room was a sales office and display area where they could show their products that they were trying to sell. This is a little life in the Longleaf there. They encouraged people to put in gardens. They had chickens, pigs, things like that. In interviewing one of the workers that was there through the Depression areas, he said they didn't know there was a Depression. It was unknown to them, other than they didn't work 6 days a week. They only worked 4 to 5. One of the things the Krolls did is they tried to encourage people, if somebody got sick, injured, died, had a birth, let's take up a little collection form. So you can fill this out and they take out a little money out of your check. You put down how much you want out of your check, or you could pay them directly when they came around, and they would do this and then pass money on to the family. Well, the white workers had regular houses. The black workers pretty well had these. They were a duplex house split down the middle, and that was housing for most of those. They did put in a phone system. They had their own telephone system in here. And of course, if you look at it, the Krolls pretty well had the whole thing except for White, who was the railroad man. And it was set up in one of the ladies' houses, and she did that out of her house and took care of the phone. They did have their own baseball league, the Longleaf. They would play other sawmill towns in Louisiana and Texas and travel around. So they got a little extra recreation in that direction. The mill was basically closed 3 days a year. That was about it. It was closed on Christmas and on Thanksgiving and on Juneteenth. That's when this photo was taken, was the Juneteenth holiday. They were they'd have a big barbecue dinner on Juneteenth and listen to political speeches. Fire was probably the thing that bothered them the worst in Longleaf. All too common. So they had things going out to patrol the area to keep things down, look around the right of way. They had a lot of fire protection equipment. These were all over the place. Fire hoses were all over. The buckets like this, they said it was they were pointed like that to make it easier to dip water out of the creek. Some said it was so people didn't steal them. And then after they had a fire in the planer mill in Alexandria, they decided to take the planer mill here. They put in a sprinkler system on this one, and there's a sprinkler system there. This is the water area. This pumped water up into the tank. They had a water tank on the site, and it would pump water up in there and keep it in there. So in case there was a fire, it was not used for drinking. It was strictly used for fire protection and for wetting down areas to keep fire from starting. We'll take a trip into the sawmill. The first sawmill burned. It was a water-powered mill. That's what he bought it on the property. This was the second mill that they put up, and it was basically put up so we could get production, do some heavy timber work so we could build another sawmill. This was the configuration of the mill. Here's the sawmill up here with the log pond. Here is the round, this would be the roundhouse and machine shop, and the planer mill is over here. The original sawmill was down on the other side of the creek here. Yes, that's the angle of log cars. They decided to use gravity to unload it, and gravity is what they did. They pushed the cars on. When they got to this point, the cars would usually start dipping. If they needed a little assistance, the guy would put a cant hook up here, hook onto a log and give it a little tug and hope it didn't come toward him. This is about 1910, 1911. It was all wood on the outside at that period. It had 4 steam engines in here using 2 stacks. This is part of the wood storage. Here's the boiler room. There's the sawmill. This is the kiln at that time. Everything they had was up on these wooden tramways. Soil over there gets pretty wet and gummy, so they kept everything up high. This is the mill in 1929. There's coming through. At this point, it's got a sawmill. This is the new mill. It's got the sawmill on this side, and it's still got a circular saw on this side. There he is bringing wood into the mill. They tried to keep about a 2-day supply in the mill, and it made it a lot easier to sort it out there. But here you can see where they dumped there's a log crane that had just dumped its cars. He's out there doing a little sorting. During the war years, the Krolls really took into this. They were very big on trying to help the war effort. Lots of signs were put up inside the mill and still there that the Army needs your help. They also helped train. There was Camp Claiborne was right nearby. Here you see some fellows learning how to do some work on the railroad that came over from Camp Claiborne. Here's another group. They rebuilt the bridge going to Meridian. After the fire, they didn't use it, but they needed the timber out there, so this crew came in and rebuilt it. Their next assignment was going to Alaska to build the Elkan Highway when they left there. It was a black engineering battalion. Lumber and that for the PT boats, they wanted that. Higgins was a big industry in Louisiana. They made the boats that were used on D-Day. So they made the ramp boats and landing craft. And Kroll's pretty well helped them a lot and kept going. Matter of fact, they wrote a letter to Roosevelt when the Navy disliked Higgins. They wrote a letter saying how they were helping them and motivating them through them and trying to get things going. And Higgins did end up getting the contract, and Eisenhower said that's the boats that won the war. This was the last remodel, 1956. They got rid of all the railroad was gone at this time. They extended this, and everything was brought in by truck. This is outside loading areas and unloading a truck coming in. Here's the mill as you see it. You notice one thing here, there's a lot of difference in siding. What happened is this is a shotgun carriage. It misfired and shot the guy out through the wall. The fellow was fine, he only missed a day of work. It's milling a little later. This is now, it's got more boilers in here. It's up to 8 boilers and running the mill. There's logs coming in. They would set them on this chain. It would bring them over, bring them up. This was the original chain that brought them in. They modified it to hook up to this table. That happens to be one of the Alan Kroll there. He's not cutting that, but that's the cutoff saw that would greet you as you're coming into the mill. As you come into the mill, things got cut. This was called the short side. This was called the long side. and these chains are hung every 2 foot. So the man coming in, he could see the length of the log. If he needed to cut it, he could cut it and still have a piece left over that was good enough to sell. Here it is working. This is the long side. He's got the logs coming in. The sawyer would sit in this little booth. He would fire the shotgun carriage to move it. He would look through this side of the window at this log to figure out what he was going to make his cuts and figure his cuts to sell the logs that they already had sold. This was one of their later carriages. It only took one man. He would take hand signals from the man sitting here, and he would set this to the size of the piece that he was going to cut. A couple more shots. This is the swamper getting ready to catch a board as it comes off, and then they would send him on its way on the live roll. This is, we'll go up to the saw filer. He was the highest paid man. This happens to be February 14th in the 1960s. They shut it down that night and it never went. So they never changed the blade. It came up for sharpening. It got put on the sharpening stand, but it never went anywhere. So that was the last day of operations. Some of the other equipment, this was for doing the circular saws. That big saw was then passed down through this hole in the floor, lowered down, and so they could change that one. A couple of the other saw blades up in the saw filer. And you had some bandsaw storage for extra blades. They used to cut heavy timbers. The heavy timbers would come through this way. They'd go across this on what they call the crossover, so they could go out through the back of the mill. This is the back side. The crossover's right there. They'd shoot them back. Then they get here. They'd go here, and they were able to go back out through the back side of the mill and load into waiting gondolas or flats. The edger fellows, these would be the two fellows. They're catching the live rolls here. They're able to pull them up. They trim off the bark edgings on the side, even them up. And they had a list of what they had, what was already sold. So the idea was, whatever's sold, let's get that finished. That's profit. We can sell that immediately. There's another shot of the edger looking down. They did try a fan in there one time for the fellows, but all it did was stir up the sawdust. This is the other side of the edger. You had a man here that would stand in here, and he would throw the scraps onto the floor where the chains would drag him to the burn pit. He'd also have to watch the two sides here to throw any trash off. He'd pull one of the levers to move it. It's another shot. There's the man working the bear, is what it was called, and he's throwing trash off to the side. They would come down, go across to here, and at that point they'd be cut to length. They had a series of cutoff saws that swung down from the ceiling, and as they swung down from the ceiling, they would be pretty well taken care of there and cut off. Or then later days they'd come down here and go into this area, and this was a newer cutoff saw, and blades would come up from the bottom. That's going out of the mill they'd go through the vat to prevent mold, and then they'd be stacked out on the lumber out on the side of the area. It would either go out here for air drying, or it would go over to the dry kiln. And at the dry kiln that was the first one. And this is the loading of the dry kiln area. And then you've got them. This was the newest dry kiln. It would go into there. Had steam pipes throughout the inside of this, and it would take about 18 to 24 hours to dry the wood down to where they could go over to the planer mill. At this point here, it was then sorted and gone through storage and left out there. The heavy timbers would come out through this direction, and the heavy timbers then would come over, and they were put on this area to slide down the mill, and then the rail cars would be parked here. So the timbers would move that way. There you can see the tracks. They had basically a little trolley that went back and forth across the top here, and you just push them onto this, and they used old rail that they spiked into that. Although some of the timbers weren't big enough, some of those timbers ended up this way, and they were pretty well hand carried into the gondolas. This is the mill after the last remodel, and they got rid of the railroad. All that's gone. This is pretty well how it worked until its final configuration. and it stayed that way until the museum took over. This was one of the steam engines underneath. It was a large coreless that powered everything, was belt powered from underneath. Work ramps, they pretty well worked. All power came up from the bottom. There was no overhead belt system in this area. This was this would be the one that would kick the logs either the short or the long side. This would hold the clamp where that big saw was that you seen coming in to cut the logs to length. And anything that wasn't used basically went through this. It was a grinding situation, and it sent it out to this, what looked like a baseball field. It's just a big field. They'd run it out, and this thing burned pretty well 24 hours a day out there, 7 days a week. And from that, you've pretty well been through the mill, and I think I've used my 45 minutes worth of time. So if there's any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer any questions, and we can see what happens from there. Right now, the mill is called the Southern Forest Heritage Museum, and it is open Tuesday through Saturday over in Louisiana. It's located about 30 miles south of Alexandria. So if you're in the area, stop by. It's well worth the tour.
Chuck, this is Neil. I'm actually from Hawaii, so I don't have much knowledge of Louisiana. Are you living in Louisiana now, or you still live up in Illinois?
No, I live in Texas.
Neither.
I'm about neither one.
Okay.
Yeah,
I wondered. You're also you're the president of the Lone Star region, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I live about 30 miles from Texas A&M University in a little town called Navasota.
Okay, I know where Texas A&M is. So how did you get involved in Longleaf? I mean, this is kind of a long drive for you, isn't it?
It's about a 5-hour drive. Actually, I was on my way to Florida, and I broke down. My car broke down in Louisiana, and I was in a real bad mood. And my wife said, "Don't come home until you get in a better mood." And somebody told me about this museum that was just opening up. I went by and seen it, and I've been working over there pretty well ever since. So, anything else?
I don't know if we've not just lost Neil. This is Gordy. Chuck, you still there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Gordy.
Cool. No, it's okay. I don't think we've got any other questions that I'm seeing here at this point. Oh, and while we've done that, Andy Ambrose has asked a question. He says, "You never imagined lumber." It's all right, Neil. It's okay. Andy asks, he says, "He never imagined lumber in the southeast. Always thought of it as being always from the northwest. What proportion of lumber produced in the United States was produced in the southeast forest?"
In the southeast, I can tell you this because I did another one on the Texas mills and things like that. And in the teen years, 1910 through about 1920, about 30% of the lumber used in the United States came out of the South. It's still a pretty good business. The Kroll family is still in the logging business. They don't have a sawmill. All they do is raise the wood and cut it. It's pretty well an operation over there. There's a lot of log trucks in Louisiana and East Texas. It's still a multi-billion-dollar industry in both states.
This is pretty much Southern pine.
Yeah, it's a Southern pine. It's a hybrid. What they did originally, the pine was called Longleaf pine, really nice pine. Now it's more of a hybrid tree. The idea is to raise it. You plant it. 10 years, you take out every tree east-west, every other tree. 10 more years, you take out every other tree north-south, and in 30 years, you clear cut it. So they plant about 1 million trees every year, the Kroll family does.
I bet you don't see a lot of that large, heavy timber anymore. Some of the pictures you were showing of like 6x12s and 8x8s, those are pretty good sized trees.
Yeah, unfortunately, but most of the trees I see over there are about 14, 16 inches across the base. It's not real big.
So we had a question about the steam-powered mill or locomotives. Is there any possibility of restoring some of those, getting things running again?
Probably not in the mill. The boilers in there are pretty bad shape. We are working on trying to cosmetically repair some of the engines and things like that to get them a little better. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of funding. Louisiana is not a prosperous state. This may sound silly, but our biggest income right now is off of weddings. People want to get married in a rustic setting. They get married in the planer mill. And thank goodness for that, because that's keeping us going right now and giving us money. This pandemic didn't help the weddings since we had to cancel those. So we're hurting a little bit this year.
Well, for people that are listening in other parts of the world, I was looking where Longleaf is, and you said it's about 30 miles south of Alexandria, which it looks like Alexandria is northwest of like Baton Rouge, halfway to Shreveport. That's
Yeah.
about right in Louisiana. So about central Louisiana, right?
Yes, sir. The hurricane went right through there.
I was curious.
We didn't
'cause
get
Lake
hurt other than a
Charles.
few. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Lake Charles isn't too far south of there.
Yeah. The eye pretty well went right through a Longleaf. We lost a few trees, but no damage to any buildings or any of the other structures we have around there. Thank goodness.
Well, that's pretty lucky. This is being broadcast via YouTube Live. For some reason, Facebook isn't working right now, but this will be available and recorded so that people can log in and check out your presentation again. It seems to me there are so many questions as you're going through that I'm going to have to back up and watch this again. But thank you so much.
Okay. Be glad to help you anytime. Thank you.
Gordy or
Yeah,
Speed, you guys have any questions?
No, so we're going to go and do the wheel of chat.